Welcome. I am Sally Thornton. We are going to talk about building and unleashing your team. And because I want to specialize in what this room needs most, raise your hand if hiring is more important to you than anything else right now. Okay, now raise your hand if energizing yourself and figuring out how to unleash your team is most important to you right now. Okay, raise your hand if all of it's important to you. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about work because there's a lot of myths around how to hire and retain and unleash your team. And when I talk about the science, it's about behavioral science, so behavioral economics, social psychology, and neuroscience, because now with MRIs being much more affordable, we've learned so much more in the last 10 years about how the brains work and therefore how people make decisions. And we'll be building on, did anyone not see Nur's talk on Indistractable? Okay, great, because I'm going to build on that. He had some slides that I have. His looked better. And you will get a copy of the slides, so if you want to take pictures, you're welcome. But I will also share the slides in PDF. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story because we know as product people that we learn through story. And I'm going to put in there some data so that we remember the data. So I am from Minnesota. Anyone Midwest? Oh, all right. Oh, my gosh. Okay. I learned to work at an early age picking strawberries because agriculture laws allowed you to work earlier in agriculture, and I loved work. Yes? Okay. So went to University of Minnesota, and then I graduated in a recession, so I had to go to New York to get a job. And I still have my 917 cell phone number because I love New York so much, where I learned to walk and talk really, really fast. So I'm going to talk really, really fast. And I met my husband, who was working at Wall Street, also from Minnesota, because that's how Minnesota works. We did not know each other in Minnesota. There's actually 4 million people. We met in New York, but then we were like, oh my God, you're from Minnesota? And we would only see each other on Saturday nights because he was Wall Street and I was consulting, and we thought that was totally normal. We worked all the time. So then he came out to the Bay Area in 1999 and went to the GSB. And so when he graduated, he said, should I move back to New York or should you come out to the Bay Area? And it's 1999, so the answer is Bay Area. So I come out. I'm working for a high-tech company. I'm running compensation, working with the board, and I love data, and I love, the feeling of I'm in the mix of it, right? So my brother calls, actually it was my sister who called first and said, it's Mom's 60th birthday coming up. Fly out to Minnesota and we'll surprise her. My brother will fly home from Toledo, Ohio. It'll be great. Except there's this thing. I have a really important job. I'm director of compensation. I have a high-tech company. People are relying on me. I can't do this. I work all the time. My husband's now at McKinsey, working all the time. So it was then my brother who called me and said, get on the plane, because he had leukemia when I was growing up, and he learned carpe diem. And so he said, carpe diem, get on the train. I noticed I'm being videoed, so I'm like, mother bloody, get on the plane. So I get on the bloody plane, and in the Midwest, we do not wear boas or rent limos. So you can tell that it's a 60th birthday party because we spent money, and Midwesterners don't spend money. I am 5 months pregnant, and we still believe that sparkling apple juice, like Martinelli's or something, because I'm pregnant, but it might not have been. And it was great. So I fly back to the Bay Area, working my way. I'm 8 months pregnant, and my dad calls. My brother had been killed in a plane crash. He was 37. And my world was rocked. He was my big brother, the person who would always take care of me if something happened. And I thought I was going back home to see my mom, and I didn't know it would be the last time I would see my brother. So what happens in the Bay Area when you have a breakdown is you look at data and say, what the hell did I miss? Because I thought I was doing the right thing. I was working really, really hard. And what I found in the data was that this is not just my problem, that all of us as a bell curve really prioritize work. And sometimes at the cost of making really bad decisions, which thankfully I didn't make that day. But I was only saved by a lot of people around me, which I'll talk to you about in the science. So what happens when you see data and you have a mental breakdown is you start a company in the Bay Area. So, right? So Flexperience was my first company. It was experienced professionals who wanted to do flexible work. They wanted to have more control over their works and lives. And it was basically like we're recruiters, but for contract hires. And it was Stanford who shared with me this great research on how we think about work is really quite outdated. And what's fascinating about this is that even though we know this intellectually, we don't change our habits. right? So building on Nur's idea of like, how do we change our habits? So I want you to have a new model for work and life, and it's the part right here that we typically don't take care of, which I call oxygen mask first, because Stanford calls it leisure. I like it oxygen mask first. And it's about earning an impact and ongoing learning. So this is a visual I want you to have, because this is actually threaded through how we make decisions in our work and how our team makes decisions as we're hiring and we're unleashing the team, right? We have to think about impact. And of course, we have to be financially rational, because the Bay Area is very expensive, or Berlin, or all the places that you came from, New York City. So I want you to understand this science, because part of it is flawed in how we think about hiring and retaining our top talent. One of the biggest flaws is we believe more work is better. Raise your hand if you've done amazing work at something and your reward was more work. Okay, so the challenge for that is it actually doesn't feed our creativity, which is what we're really paid to do, right? We're really paid to think at our highest and best use. So the biggest thing I learned in the social science was about the ideal worker. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the ideal worker. So yeah, I mean, only social scientists at Stanford, so none. So the ideal worker is tall, white, male, extroverted, has a stay-at-home wife, and when you ask children today to draw a picture of a leader, what do they draw? Same thing. It's 2019, same thing. So we have to understand these biases and these myths, because it works against us. It's that unseen fabric of how we're making decisions, right? So this was a social science word that's not really social science. So it's flex. When I called it flexperience, I didn't know I was violating this ideal worker norm, because by calling it flexperience, the women loved it. I had tons of women who signed up. And the men were like, so they're not going to work all the time? What about 24/7, right? That's how we roll. And so I renamed it after my brother. So Forche is a company for me that is about how do you do your best work on terms that work for your full life without regrets, right? And I named it sort of like McKinsey or Bank. My husband was at McKinsey, and we can make fun of them because there's so much to make fun of. But it was sort of didn't have that bias, right? It just sounds like a generic name, but it's the same idea of how do we do building teams, consulting, and diversity inclusion. So that's kind of how Forche has grown. We had to rename and think about how people make their decisions better. So as an entrepreneur, I keep looking at the research, because I need to make sure that what I'm solving on will remain true and important in the future of work. And when I asked a bunch of really smart people, I started writing a book. Oh, wrong. I started researching a book that has not yet been written. And when you're researching a book, people who shouldn't give you the time of day are suddenly like, yes, you are working with Stanford on a book? Yes. So I started looking at what's going to remain true and important about the future of work, so that as we're building teams, we're making really smart decisions, not just about the moment, but about the medium term and the long term. And really the only thing that came out of all of that, because I briefly went back on the word cloud, but it was crazy words. Really, all these smart people disagree is kind of the nut of it. The only thing that really came out of Institute of the Future was VUCA. Have you guys seen this before? Okay, so basically, the future of work is crazy. That's what that means. So we have to think about the signal from the noise, and how do we, therefore, when we're making decisions on teams and life, because this is all integrated, we have a very blended world today, right? We're very mobile. That's what I'm going to focus on, is what remains true and important as you're doing these things. Okay, so I'd love to hear from you why you came. So tell me, if anyone would just shout out, is hiring the most challenging? Is sourcing the most challenging? Is figuring out who from a diversity inclusion the most important? Any shout outs? All of it? Engaged? Retention. Oh, okay, great. And we're going to have time to work on some of this, so you'll be able to reflect. This is not just me talking at you. We're going to workshop this. So when it comes to skills, there's actually just a few things I want you to focus on. One is we've moved from jobs to work. The longer the job description, the less likely a woman is to apply. And frankly, it tends to be static. Job descriptions, if you actually looked at the job description you were hired at versus what you do, typically they're very different. So I want you to think about job descriptions in terms of the work and attributes versus the job. Does that make sense? It's a shift. And then I really like IDEO in the way they think about the T. Raise your hand if you know IDEO's T. Okay, great, when I'm talking about it. So new science on job crafting is about basically co-creation. So this is the pretty one, and this is the not pretty one, because I want you to have the handout. So the not pretty one is essentially anytime you're thinking about a job, if you think about it in collaboration with the person at the end. So you certainly want to say, like, here are the 5 critical skills that we're going to work on that I want to make sure you have, competency in. But then I want you to think about how to co-create that job on an ongoing basis, right? Because work is very modular and it's changing very quickly. So job crafting is a really, really important thing to do in the what. So that's the what. But the who tends to be, honestly, like 70% of it is that cultural add part. Do you guys know the difference between cultural add versus cultural fit? Okay, so fit is typically when we want someone to look like and be like us. So fit is, I want to have a beer with this person, right? Even if I don't drink beer. But I drink tequila with a little bit of lime. The add is someone who brings in complementary ideas but the same values, right? So when I'm hiring people at my company, I want to say, how do you think about working 24/7? Because we don't, right? But how do you think about goals and being really clear about what success looks like? Because we look at that every week, right? So when you think about values, that's like critical. And then when you think about cultural add, it's adding in diverse perspectives that help you come up with creativity. So we've seen the data over and over and over again. Has anyone not been convinced that diversity works for the bottom line? Okay, fantastic. So if you don't have it, you can use that as your handout for your friends and your team. So I keep a lot of data in there so you can have it as a handout, but you don't need to talk about it. Raise your hand if your company believes that you're a meritocracy. Raise your hand if you want to become a meritocracy, but you're not there yet. Okay, so that's actually in the research, you're more likely to be successful. When we believe that we already have a meritocracy, the research out of MIT is we're actually, therefore, kind of a little complacent. Because we're like, oh yeah, no, we're a meritocracy. We believe the best idea wins, everyone's heard. What we've seen in the data is that's actually the opposite, because you kind of go like, oh yeah, we do that. So then you don't create interruptions that work around the bias. So consider that we're always a work in progress, and that when you say you're something, it actually then also puts you to a really high standard versus a growth mindset where we're working towards that. Okay, so one of the key things that we hire on now, this is very important. Has anyone not seen growth mindset? Okay, so you all know it. So this is your handout then for all your team. So we really want to make sure that when we're hiring, that we're looking for people who are learners. And that to me is like the number one thing I look at when I'm talking to someone is, when they're really, really experienced, is how do you integrate new ideas? And when you're a beginner, it's how do you adapt quickly and learn? So raise your hand if you feel like the multi-generational workforce is a challenge. Okay, so we'll go over this. So the thing to understand about the multi-generational workforce is there's actually really good data that we make better decisions in a multi-generational team. So BMW did a study where they had older engineers and younger engineers on a project team. They had just all older, all just younger. And what they found in the data was that the best, because they ran the same project, it was an A/B test, right? Of how's it gonna work? I guess A, B, C, D, whatever test. And the team that had both older and younger workers had the highest efficacy with the fastest turnaround, whereas the younger team had high turnaround but had mistakes in the design. And the older group had really good efficacy but took too long for the timing that was given to them. So harnessing the value of every generation actually, again, produces better outcomes, which is what we're measured on for creativity. So the thing that typically is negative in the bias, back to how we make fast decisions, is that the older workforce isn't growth mindset, but yet they can be, anyone can be, so it's how do you test for that? If you have a bias, and we all do, it's neuroscience, that's I don't know this person, the one I always hear is their energy is not great. And I was like, oh, so they're over 40? Is that what you're saying? There's language in recruiting that's approved language, and it's their energy isn't great. That means old. Then the one we hear from millennials is, they have really high expectations, and I'm just not really sure they're going to be a great cultural fit, right? And then I'm like, okay, I have to explain cultural fit. So I want to take away some of the myths that millennials are a problem, because frankly, none of us are a problem. It's how do you harness the best of all of us? So the reality is that this is what's true. And there's a lot of stuff that says the opposite, so I want to sort of pull out what's true, but I'm not going to talk about it because I want you guys to have time to think through things. The other thing is, the biggest one that I hear that I want to dispel is the me generation, that they're very self-focused. So this is an ages and stages challenge with the science where we conflate, like, once we become older, not that I'm older, but I'm 72, just heard myself really well, is that we believe when we were younger that we weren't like that. But what the demographers do is they ask the same questions at every life stage of each generation. And we Gen Xers are the same as millennials, are the same as baby boomers around being self-centered at that age, right? So it's an age issue, it's not a personality issue. And also the work ethic. That's another thing that if you hear this, I call it sludge, like people who just repeat stuff that's not in the data. You can say like, oh, actually, I think in the science that's not true. Okay, so now as you're hiring, focus on what they want, which is to be judged on results, to be thinking about purpose, to be coached. I mean, no one really wants a boss. To focus on their strengths. And then this is the slide that I think could be your like little quick guide of what we all want to focus on. Because this is what matters, right? We can talk about the differences. The differences are important because we want to have multiple perspectives in the room, but then we want to harness on what's aligned, right? And so this is actually the new data that we haven't seen before that Adam Grant did was how to grow professionally without taking a step back at home. And so we'll talk about that in the energizing section because that's retention, Tyler. That was like when we talked about retention as a top issue. It tends to be people feel like there's a conflict, and we're going to address that today. Okay, so what matters the most is meaning. I've been really interested in what Satya Nadella has done at Microsoft around doubling down on growth mindset and meaning. These are very longitudinal data sets around how to focus. So yeah, take a picture of that. The Japanese have something called the ikigai that I've adapted that has more science behind it because the ikigai, the Japanese also have a word for death by overwork. It's karoshi. And I'm like, if you have a word for death by overwork, I might not follow your career advice. Like that's, so, but I like Venn diagrams, right? Who doesn't like a Venn diagram? So this is all fueled by data. So we know that when we're learning, we're growing and fueled. We know that purpose matters, what the world needs. We know we need to have some economic stability. Although that data is much lower than you'd think. Do you guys know what the data is? Like how much money where happiness and money stop being correlated?
65.
Yeah, exactly. It's like 75-ish.
Is that in the Bay Area?
So it is the #1 question. I also get that in New York, by the way. It's like bi-coastal, I would say add, another 50. And then what do you do well is the strengths finder. And this is the difference when we were raised. When we were raised, it was like you must get an A in everything. And now the way that we're raising kids in the growth mindset is focus on your strengths, but just don't have like, really hard misses, I guess. Okay, I want you to write down for your company, what does it mean to be a cultural ad? You got 60 seconds. A cultural ad. So when I talk about that, and I talk about it from Forche's perspective, what does it mean for DocuSign? What does it mean for Flatiron Health? Who is a cultural ad to your team? It might be generational. It might be race. It might be global. Team. The reason I say team is because when you're in a really big company, the person who you're hiring is joining your team. Now, obviously, if they don't agree with the leadership, that's a challenge, but I want you to get really specific and tangible about today, when you're going to be hiring next week, how are you going to define for your team what a cultural ad is for your team? And then I want you to also test that back with your team. All right, we're going to move to unleashing your team. And this is actually where I have the most passion because I believe, as you saw from my story, that more work was like awesome. And yet, when it comes to teams, that's where we lose the most people because they feel this friction. So I want you to think about creativity as your North Star when you think about energy, right? And Nur talked about this. So there's actually some slides I'm going to go zooming through because he already talked about it. But the way I think of it is based in data. This is what I learned when I was trying to figure this out for myself. So how much sleep do you need to be doing your best thinking? 7 hours. 8. 8.5. Okay, raise your hand if you sleep fewer than 7 hours. Okay, so your one action item is to sleep 7 hours. So what they found in the data is that less than 7 hours of sleep is the same as being drunk driving, which none of you people do. So typically when we don't sleep, it's because we're doing it on the benefit of someone else. We're very other-oriented. I'm doing it to take care of my family. I'm doing it because I'm helping my team late at night. I'm doing it because I really like Netflix. So if you instead say 7 hours of sleep actually is the most beneficial thing I can do for all of these people I care about, you'll be more likely to do it. Because what happens in the data is we sort of feel like, especially in American and Midwestern, it was like, you'll sleep when you're dead, work all the time. But the neuroscience is really clear. And there's a great book called Why We Sleep. Has anyone read it? Why We Sleep is awesome. Neuroscientists out of Cal last year is fantastic. So if you have sleep challenges, 'cause a lot of times people want to sleep, but they can't, like there's something going on, that book is the one I recommend. So I actually do what Nerd does, and I hack it with technology. So instead of using your phone to be an alarm to wake you up in the morning, I want you to use your alarm to set you to go to sleep, right? So think about your phone as like, I'm gonna use this as a trigger for me to know it's time for me to wind down. So I did this in the beginning. I've been doing this for 15 years, but now I don't have to do it. It's sort of like you do this to create a new habit, but then you don't have to do it anymore. But setting your alarm to go to sleep for me really worked. So NASA did some research that basically showed in 26 minutes you can increase your performance by 34% by doing what? Nap. Now, Genentech saw this science, Google has seen this science, and they've put in nap pods. Does anyone have nap pods in their company? Does anyone use them? No. Okay, beautiful. It's the difference between neuroscience and social science. Okay, so the neuroscience is, I'm a NASA astronaut. I'm going to increase my performance. The idea is I nap every day. The ideas I come with as I'm going into my nap, I'm like, oh, that's such a good idea. And then as I come out of it, like for an hour, I have good ideas, and then I'm dumb again. The ideas are what matter, but what happens is the social science, and so Genentech had to actually put walls between where you'd walk to the nap pod, so that like when you're walking to the nap pod, you didn't have to be like, right? So the social science is, I want you to be the ideal worker. You don't need a nap. Like, people don't nap, that's lazy people. Instead, I want you to think like, I am a NASA astronaut, and I'm gonna go boost my brain. I'll be right back. Give me about 26 minutes. Okay, so sleep is crucial, not just to doing things like not having Alzheimer's, right? All these longitudinal things around health. The number one thing is sleep. But it's also sense making, divergent thinking. And the scientists, I love this, not a wasted opportunity for productivity, right? Because we sort of feel like that. We're like, oh, but then I'm not getting one more email done, right? So it's a switch in mindset. I want you to think about feeding your brain and how that actually makes you better. So it's a shift in how we think. This is really sad data about why I don't mind having the 1 o'clock workshop time, because right now you are totally open to new ideas. So this is research that was done on judges who, whether they were going to give you parole, mattered more about when they ate last. So they studied how the judges made decisions of whether someone gets parole. You've seen this study. And the most likely time for you to get parole is if the judge has eaten recently, right? So this goes to decision fatigue data, which is we think we are rational. We are making decisions all day that are not rational, right? So when you want to make a new idea, pitch for a business, do you do it after lunch? Yes. Do you do it after breakfast? Yes. When I have a new client and they want to meet me at 4 o'clock, I'm like, oh, I can never do 4. No, because you're not open to any new ideas, right? So whether you're pitching, use this information to think about when are we open to new ideas so we minimize decision fatigue. And this matters for your teams, right? So when you're hiring, when you're making big decisions, how do you think about this as a team? Because we think we're incredibly intellectual, but we're really not. So these are the quick hacks for your energizing and your team energizing. So when is the best time to exercise in the day? Morning for metabolism. What else?
Evening.
Afternoon for muscle growth and least likely to get injured. Evening, oh yeah. So evening's challenging because it's hard to go to sleep. So if you exercise at night, and you have a sleep challenge, that's your answer right there. So for me, because I'm incredibly lazy, although I'm learning self-compassion talk because of NER, I like efficiency with my time. 5 minutes after you eat is the most efficacious for your metabolism. So when people say I don't have time to work out, I'm like, just walk for 5 minutes after you eat. It's the best thing for making your blood sugar neutralized, and all the diabetics know this, and I learned it when I was pregnant and maybe had some pre-diabetes stuff. Learn from science. Okay, the 5 people you hang out with affect you more than anyone else. When I've given this data before to teams, I have seen some intentional change or turnover of who's on the team. So we know this is for, as social scientists, if we hang out with people who smoke, we're more likely to smoke. If we hang out with people who exercise, we're more likely to exercise. If you hang out with people who are optimistic, like Amanda talked about this morning, when she was like, right, I come into my team, if I have energy, what does my team have? Energy, right? So the 5 people you hang out with affect you greatly. You can't always choose this in terms of like siblings and parents. You can kind of change your kids, but not really. But you can definitely change it with your team. So think about who is an energy vampire and consider a shift. The other thing that's important in the team science is we used to believe there was something called the feedback sandwich, right? So you're like, I'd give a positive something, and then I'd tell you what I really want to say, and then I'd say something positive, and then we'd smile, and then you'd go away and maybe do it, right? Constructive feedback. What they've seen in the data is it doesn't work anymore. And I don't know if it's because they got caught onto it, like the feedback sandwich is like out there, but now Dr. Gottman has this 5-to-1 ratio, which is you have to say 5 positive things before you say 1 challenging thing, because his inference of that is that it means you've been seen. If I can say 5 positive things about you before I say the 1 thing that I would like you to give you constructive criticism on, that person's like, okay, you've seen me. Like you have my back, you've seen that I have positive attributes, I will listen to this, right? So if you've had employees on your team who are not really open to your ideas, this is the data for you. How do you give them so much positivity that they can hear you when you say the negativity? Now, this is your mother-in-law. It's like a 30-to-1 ratio. But I also recommend you do this at home. It might be like a 10-to-1 ratio with your spouse. Depends on your dynamics. The other thing we were just talking about at lunch was when we don't have time to exercise. So raise your hand if you're like, I have no time to exercise. Okay. So the 7-minute app was written up by the New York Times like 7 years ago or something. I've done it routinely since because you can do it when you're traveling. It's like fantastic. It's free. It's on your phone. Back to that, like how do you use your phone for good? So the 7-minute app does like 30 seconds of jumping jacks, 30 seconds of wall sits, and it's the equivalent of a 45-minute run. I used to run for 45 minutes before kids. And then after kids, I was like, I can't do that. That's not what a good mom does. But I can do 7 minutes. So this morning, before I came, I was like, I'm just going to be 7 minutes late to start, right? I got to hear all your talks, though. But it was like, I'm going to do the 7 minutes because it's going to make the rest of my day better. So we have to, again, like create these positive habits. And if you do it as a team, the social sciences, you're more likely to do it. So like for anyone who's here with team members, although I think you're all kind of leading teams back at your office, consider bringing this back to the team because anything you adopt as a team, sort of like what Nura was talking about with the focus time, what was it called, like focus mate? So consider this your 7-minute mate. Like who is someone that you're like, all right, let's do the 7-minute app because I used to think I didn't have time, but I do. So best and highest use, that's exactly what Nura was talking about. Whenever we're thinking about this, we want to get rid of multitasking and replace it with multipliers. This is research out of Stanford, Jennifer Acker, who happens to be my best friend. But even if she wasn't, her data is really good. And she basically said, instead of multitasking, raise your hand if you've been told I'm really good at multitasking. Yeah. Oh my God, guys. So normally I only get women's hands. Well done. Typically this is like given to women, like you're so good at multitasking, you're going to do 7 things at once. It lowers your IQ. You get it back. And it exhausts you. So instead, I want you to get rid of the bad science or the bad myths and instead have the science. So the science is how do you multiply things that have a better outcome. So for me, one thing I do with Jennifer is we will go for a walk and talk about work because she studies social psychology and I learn social psychology and then teach others. So if you can do a walk and talk with your team, does anyone already do this, like a walk and talk? Yeah. So like keep doing that, make that social, and then think about other things where you feel like if you can't get something done, how do you do it together? So one I did as a parent was I said, instead of doing the financials of the Girl Scouts at home, spreadsheets, like all by myself. That's like a single. All I'm doing is being a good community member. Instead, I'm going to be leading the field trip. Now I'm outside in nature. I'm with friends, other parents. I get to see my kid be a total schmuck with other kids and be like, let me teach you constructively with 5 and 1 negative things. And I get to help the community. So that's a multiplier, right? I have multiple things that I'm achieving with one activity, and then I've taken away the excuse of like, I don't have time to be in the school, I'm a CEO, or whatever my excuse is. I'm an all-in worker, right? So I want you to also understand that play really, really keeps you energized, back to like, how do we, make fun in the workforce? Not the workhorse. Nur already talked about this. Calendar what's important. So I did this experiment for myself. I put like date night with my husband, which typically was the last thing on my list. It was like my kids, work, my friends, exercise. Like if I had to list them, I was like embarrassed to see how my priority list was. So that was where multipliers came in. How do we not have false choices? And calendaring. So it was like, all right, I need to block time with my spouse because I find marriage to be better than the opposite. So calendar what matters. And this is the simple like little hacks around like, let's just do it. For 5 seconds, I want you to think about what you're grateful for and imagine your brain is doing this because it is. Okay, 5 seconds. I love neuroscience. Okay, so metacognition is thinking about how you think. This is super important for energizing you and your team because if we don't think about how we're thinking, this is what building on nerve stuff, then we're gonna have the same horrible thoughts. And I love this data because it's like so overwhelmingly big. So this is what Cleveland Clinic says is the number of thoughts we have per day. Guess what percentage of them are negative? Wait, I have to do it right. Guess what percentage thoughts are negative? How many? Most of them. Give me a number. Your data people. 60, higher. 80. 80% of our thoughts are negative. Now, what percentage thoughts, and I don't know how they actually figure this out, are the same every day?
Wait,
higher.
Day to day or within the day?
Day to day. Higher. 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 98. So this is data that basically says most of our decisions are made by the limbic system. We routinize anything, right? Like remember how you're driving home, but you're not really driving home, and then all of a sudden you're driving home? That's the limbic system, okay? So like you're just kind of doing the same thing. We do the same thing. We go to the same coffee place, right? We call our parents on the same day. We make decisions about people the same, right? So our creativity is super limited. And this is why having our habits be positive habits where we don't have to think about it. That's why everyone says like, I have no willpower. It's because you have 2% of like new ideas every day. So what matters is how do you save your 2% for what's the most important, right? So this is what I want you to think about with your team, because what we ask of our teams, what do we need to routinize? What needs to be thoughtless and what needs to be intentional, right? So the only way to actually change your thoughts every day is meditation. And it was one of those things that like I'd heard about meditation, I read about meditation, like I love neuroscience, but it still took me like 10 years to figure it out. But then when I read Meditation's the New 30, I was like, oh, I'm in. Because I'm 72. So it's the way to think about how you think, right? So it's building on what Nur said is like, if you have an intention, then you're more likely to do it because we have too much information, right? So we have to figure out how to do this. So one hack that I have found to do this is the reticular activating system. It's this thing called the 5-minute journal that I learned this from. And basically, it's like you say 3 grateful things in the morning, and then you say 3 intentions for the day, and then you say a daily affirmation that was like from Saturday Night Live. Do you guys remember the daily affirmation? It was like, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and God damn it, people love me. He made fun of daily affirmations. So when the neuroscientist said, no, it creates cognitive dissonance, and when you say a daily affirmation, your brain is more likely to try and work to make it true. I was like, oh, okay. So I embraced my inner SNL person, and I was like, all right, I'm an emotionally connected wife and mother and daughter and sister, and oh my God, I have so many relationships, and friend. And I have a best-selling book that I have not even started. And I'm a kick-ass tennis player with a serve that people are scared of. And I'm running a $10 million company that's $6 million. So what happens is when I say things that are not true, but in the present tense, my brain has cognitive dissonance and it's super uncomfortable, and I'm working now to make it true. So I'm going to go practice my tennis serve. I'm going to work on my book proposal. I'm going to try and stay emotionally connected with my kids, even though I'm frantic. So the reticular activating system is this thing that once you say what you want, you start to look for it. So if you say, I'm interested in an electric car, and suddenly you're like, there's Teslas everywhere, right? They were always there, by the way. You just weren't paying attention to it because you were in your routine mode. So if you say, I'm interested in hiring a product manager, and suddenly you start talking about this to other people, you end up putting out that energy, and then suddenly you're at a Starbucks, and someone's next to you, and they're an amazing product manager, and you have a hire. So think about these things for yourself, and then think about them for your team. And we're going to talk about the research of why to think about them for your team. So I would love you to consider one thing for yourself, because again, I believe in oxygen mask first. The only way you're going to do this stuff is if you try one thing, do it with a friend, right? And I think any one of these, what we've seen in the research is just choose one, will allow you to be a better leader and allow you to come up with that energy that when you're hiring the next person, they're like, yes, I want to work for you because you are going to be one of my top 5 people of the day. So take a picture, write it down, 30 seconds. So this is longitudinal data from Leslie Perlow at Harvard Business School, and she ran an experiment with Boston Consulting Group about how more work is not better. What she found was that when Boston Consulting Group called and said, we have a woman problem, they really said that out loud in a phone to a professor. She was like, I'm an ethnographer. I'm going to come and watch how you work. Does anyone know what ethnography is? Yeah, you guys know what ethnography is. No one else in the world knows what ethnography is. I'm always like, it's anthropology for the alive. So she came into the alive people and watched them work, and what she found was that they didn't have a woman problem. They had a lack of predictability problem. So back to that 24/7, the teams were always on. When you're billing extraordinary rates to clients, they want you to be available all the time. So they had a disproportionate, back to retention, issue because more women who have more caregiving duties still today were like, this is too hard. So she said, all right, we're going to do a team experiment. The difference between a team experiment and an individual experiment like flex time, or maybe you want to go part-time but you don't, is that you violate the ideal worker norm when you do different things on the team. So the key thing I want you to understand is it has to be a team experiment. So she ran the team experiment, and she said each person on the team gets one predictable night off a week. It sounds ridiculously low barrier. I hope you get more than one predictable night off a week. But what they found was that the quality of the work went up because it was Harvard doing the research. They let Harvard actually call the clients to say, the BCG clients, like, how's it going? And they were like, they're more organized, their communication is better, their ideas are more creative, and they were working fewer hours. Yes?
There was something similar with a 4-day work week where people would take Wednesday off.
Yes, exactly. So the key is it has to be a team, but what it shows is that more work is not better. That actually by giving a constraint, and we know this from the D school, the more you have design constraints, the more creativity can flourish. Now, if you have 72 design constraints, like no money, no investors, right? It's hard. But I want you to think about time as a design constraint instead of saying I'm always on all the time. I'd love for you to think about new language, about how you used creativity as a way of saying I'm going to have a life. Tim Harkness also did this. He's a Stanford GSB, so I always feel like you need to have kind of a local example as well. So he started Unchained Labs and did exactly what you said. I don't think he did 4-day work. He did called results-only work environment, where you could choose which meetings you go to, and you could choose which hours you worked. And he never worked Fridays, so he did the 4-hour work week, but he wouldn't tell his board. And I was interviewing him for the book back when he had just come out of the closet as a 4-day work week guy. And the board was like, well, I mean, you are hitting all your metrics. And it was like, right. So if you have clear metrics, it's much easier to say that when I have control over my time, we're going to do better. And so he did it as a whole company. And he found that some people left, some people without any structure and like being told what to do, it wasn't for them. But then he attracted other people who were very goal-oriented and knew what success looked like. And therefore, he found the culture fit, culture complement, culture add of what mattered in terms of results. Okay, so now I want you to write down, what is a team design constraint for your team that will boost creativity and lower burnout? So for BCG, it was ridiculously low, and yet the results were outstanding. I forgot to even say, BCG went from like huge turnover to one of the top places to work, and they attribute it to Leslie Perlow. So it went from like just Boston to the US to global. Also took away the thing of like, oh, it's just this issue or it's just that issue. No, it works globally. So what is one team design constraint you're going to try around time? It could be no emails after 5. So I'm working with a company where they're experimenting with, binding when emails can go out, binding that emails can't go out on the weekends. Because you can still work on the weekend, you want autonomy, but just don't email people because then they glom on as to like, well, I want to have my idea heard first, right? You get all these interesting and unfortunately kind of negative repercussions when we're always on. Does anyone want to share their idea? Because I like to learn what you're going to try. Anybody? Bueller?
We do have a problem with a lot of meetings because we're a fast meeting company.
Yes.
So one of the things that I do want to try is take maybe a half day and no meetings.
That's exactly a great idea. It has been tried and successful in a lot of companies. And so consider when you do it, so right, it's everybody is no teams that day and blocking it. And if it doesn't work, listen to why it's not working, right? It's just like a design sprint you do with your product. So consider this as a design sprint where like, oh, maybe it's not Wednesdays, maybe it's Thursdays, maybe it's not morning, maybe it's afternoon. Like,
I'm not there to do the whole day, so I'll start with like
right. Just, I would say, call it an experiment, test it, see what the feedback is, and then iterate on it. But don't give up, right? Because we're having lots of experiments around how to think about giving people space to focus and giving people space to come in late or leave early, right? A little bit goes a long way for people to have autonomy. That's what they talk about. So the reason I don't use the word flexibility anymore is because it violates the ideal worker norm. The replacement word is autonomy. We want to have autonomy over where, how, and how we get our work, and our ideas for getting our work done. Like, we don't want to be told what to do all the time. Okay. So the research that just came out, oh, look, it's my best friend again, Jennifer Acker. If you want research from anyone besides my best friend, I'll work on it later. So the journey mindset is research that she talked about, which is about how your team stays energized. So what she found was that when you achieve a goal, what we can accidentally do is be like, woo, I did it, and then kind of step back a little, right? And so with journey mindset, it was how do you have a destination goal, and typically that's more impact. So instead of it being like a goal of, metrics or something that might be more short-term, it's really big. Like my impact for me, right, is allowing people to do their best work in terms of their whole life without regrets. It's a really long impact, I'm sorry. So that's my destination. But there's a lot of milestones that I want to do to get there, like writing a book, giving talks to people where they see the research, right? Milestones, growing the company so we have more people to be doing the work. But as I achieve a milestone, if I look back on it and say, what were the top 3 positives and what were the top 3 challenges or losses, then I learn from that and take it to the next milestone. So what she really uncovered was how important language is and using metaphors, and how important, not just reflecting and saying like post-mortem, which is like my least favorite term, right? Like post-mortem, let's go to the post-mortem, like, woo! Is reflecting back the highs and the lows at specific times to keep motivation high and to keep impact focused. So it's also about defining what success looks like for you versus feeling like success has been told to you by, really awesome advertisers. Okay, we're going to talk about fluidity of teams. Raise your hand if you use consultants or contractors on your team. Great. Raise your hand if you don't, but you would like to. Okay. So the point of freelancers is basically it's a model that allows you to specialize in trade, like my favorite and maybe only thing I learned in economics. Specialize in trade is great because Maybe your team is really good at developing product, but then you need, like, was it like Tesla, right? Who said they were figuring out how to do the electric battery, but they used someone else to figure out how to do the hub or the, I can't remember all the parts. What was it?
The hat.
The hat, right? So Tesla wasn't trying to create everything. They were trying to do what they did well, but then specialize with others. This is more and more going to be how people hire. So sometimes you may find, like, if I'm having a hiring challenge, let's consider lots of ways to solve that problem. Maybe it's not a full-time hire. Someone was saying earlier they weren't sure, like, the number of PMs to engineers, and they were trying to figure that out. Ways of experimenting with questions you have around teams and skills is to do an experiment with contractors, because then it's not as expensive as letting someone go and being like, oh, we have too many PMs, and now I have to lay someone off. The team dynamics of that are so much more impactful than if you try things out with an explicit arrangement of, like, it's an experiment. We're going to try this out, see how it works. So there are new platforms to consider. So raise your hand if you've already used Upwork. Yeah, it's like the big one. But there are some global ones as well, and some ones that are really just for creative. What's interesting is IBM and this company called Hitch, which I've become an advisor to, are about creating internal mobility. So one of the challenges has been, we always think about if we need something, we go to the outside. But what if, like, actually Ha not only has, you know, skills around investing, but she has product skills, she has finance skills. Like, there's a lot of skills that often aren't used in a particular job, but they might be used by someone else. So when you're in a larger company, thinking about how you unleash talent on the inside is a great way to hire, because you can also take risks on people. What we see in the data is if you do these small experiments, and they talked about summer internships, when women were given more summer internships, well, equal amount of men and women given summer internships, the women were actually paid better than the men by like 1%. But the point was they weren't paid less. When they were given job offers, it's like, we weren't paid less because they'd been tested out. So research that shows if we can do small experiments with teams and do this internally, then you're more likely to say, like, oh, I know the value of this person because I just experienced working with them, and you pay them the same. What? Okay, I have some issues to work through. So this is also important to think about as you're hiring other people. They may want to do multiple projects instead of jobs. The idea that with serial jobs is actually shifting to more modular-based work. And so again, you have to think about this as supply and demand. If there's certain jobs that you're hiring for and they're really hard to fill, again, how do you think internally? How do you think externally? And how do you listen to what they want? If you are a good listener to where the person wants to develop their career, and typically the number one thing is they want to develop themselves. Learning. Learning is the number one. It's not compensation. I used to run compensation. It is a zero-sum game where people are just like, arr, and no one wins. My favorite example of compensation was with my kids. My husband was like, all right, Alex, you get a $2 allowance every week. And Alex, my son was like, that's amazing, right? And he walks out. And then my daughter, Julia, who's 2 years younger, walks in, and she's like, what do I get? And he was like, you get $1 a week. Not because she's a girl, because she's 2 years younger. And so she walks out, and she's like, that's amazing. And then they ended up talking. What? Who expected that? Alex stayed out here. Julia's like, why do I get $1 a week? Now, she was happy 30 seconds ago until she found a Google Doc that was produced. No. We know this happens, right? So we have to think about ways in which we understand what the other person cares about, and we will say, it's comp, it's comp, it's comp. The Bay Area is very expensive. It's not just comp. It's learning. It's, am I treated fairly? Am I heard, right? All of these things. So double down on the science of the whole person. And of course, they have to be able to live in the Bay Area, and it's $50,000 more than Minnesota. But just understand that it's a whole person and double down on that. Okay, so I want you to write this down so you have one more action item. Where are roles where you could use outside talent that would help you solve this conundrum of, we don't, like a low unemployment rate and it's really hard to hire? And how do you think about internal talent? Have you considered it? Is that an experiment you want to try within your company, across teams, right? So write down one thing you're going to try there. Yes?
So just on that last part, how do you deal with the conflict between the job.
Yes. Yes. It's an experiment. It's complicated. I think that the reality is it's complicated and interesting and worth doing. So happy to talk after when we have more time, but it's the right question. It's like, how do we figure this out? And how do you negotiate with other hiring managers about time, right? I just think the more you embrace the modern ideas of what people want, the more you're gonna be a magnet than, for talent. So just by even figuring it out, I think you're ahead of the game. Okay, last story. So when we talked about my story and how incredibly out of sync I was, the only reason that I got on a plane, I shouldn't say the only reason, I had to have multiple reasons to get on a plane, right? So if I had walked into my hiring manager's office, or I reported to the COO, if I had said to him, hey, my family's having a family reunion for my mom's birthday, I know I should go, but I have all these important things to go, so what do you think? If he had said, you should go, would I have gone? No. I wanted to be the ideal worker. If he was like, you should go, if his body language was different than his words, I wouldn't have gone, right? He was my hero that day, and I didn't know. He was just Michael Hanley, a dude from Canada, CEO of a startup on a Tuesday, who was like, yeah, you should go to that. And he said it with conviction. So I got on the plane, and I saw my mom, and I saw my brother. So I want you to understand the power you have every day, because he didn't know he was going to be my hero that day. He was just Michael Hanley on a day, right? And we have so much power in what we say every day, what we give explicit permission for and what we give implicit permission for. And so I really want you guys to embrace your power and be a hero for yourself in terms of how you're living your life in a fulfilled way, and also a hero for others, right? And just to understand this power that you have, because I want you and your teams to do their best work on the terms for their full life without regrets. Thank you.